Welcome to our new chapter of the Sign series. This time we are ahead of Scorpio season and exploring this fascinating archetype, uh, obviously very complex and layered. It takes a lot to fully grasp the context, history, mythology, and of course the depth of the Scorpio archetype and psyche. We all know about how Scorpio represent transformation, but these are big slogans and names, and it doesn't always really capture what are the intentions from an evolutionary point of view, which is the perspective here. We we look into the evolutionary perspective. The intent is always to look at what are the motivations, what is the spiritual motivation, what is the role of Scorpio in nature, in life, in our charts. So that's what we are going to unpack here: the archetype, intention, and then all the pieces come together. Scorpio's related to transformation, Scorpio's related to death, Scorpio related to sexuality, how all these things are actually connected by a thread. The evolutionary picture provides the root cause, the foundations, the spiritual intentions. This is part of the comprehensive diploma program in evolutionary astrology. So the building blocks are obviously signs, planets, and houses, but we expand to master chart analysis, understand predictive techniques, and really give empowering, life changing readings. So it's a very rich program, and a new cycle now is underway. Depending on when you're going to watch this video, um, maybe by that time, new cycles will begin. But you can start anytime because a lot of the beginning, the initial phase of the program, are self study. So it doesn't matter when you start, whenever you are ready to really take your astrology to the next level and to do astrology justice. Scorpio. Scorpio is associated with the eighth house, and it is associated also with two planets. Mars and Pluto are the rulers, and both play an important role, which is the key to understand what Scorpio is about. So I hope I'm going to unpack this in a way that makes sense to you. So Scorpio is symbolized by three animals. The one of them is the scorpion, this not so graceful and pretty animal that lives in arid desert environment and has really deep survival skills, but lives in the shadows, lives under the rocks. And of course, the sting of the Scorpio, which can also be self-inflicting. So there is something about the animal, the scorpion, that really captures some of the energy of the sign, because as we will discover and learn about, Scorpios by sign can also be very mysterious, very powerful, and feared. There can be an element of danger, nastiness, misuse of power, defense, and quite often that kind of appearance of not being the most attractive of the animal kingdom, and not being the most cuddly, it captures some of these characteristics. The snake is also a mythological creature representing the Scorpio sign. And part of the reason is that snakes, are shedding their skins, and they go through this renewal and transformation. But most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, the snake is also, living in the crevices of the earth, under the surface. Um, it's very mysterious, it's very delicate, it's very discreet, and it is venomous. It is powerful, or, whether it's venom or constriction, they they mean business. And again, it's an animal that usually people don't cuddle with. But there are exceptions. If you have a strong Scorpio, you may actually be attracted to some of these less charismatic animals, such as spiders and bats and Scorpio and snakes, that represent the renewal energy, the underworld, what is under the surface. And again, the symbolism of the snake is the depth and the ascension, that kind of going down and rising high, being able to elevate their posture as the cobra does. And then either the eagle or the phoenix. In the Bible, Scorpio is referred to as the eagle. If you read the book of Ezekiel, first chapter, the beast that is represented there, the being, not the beast, the being has four heads, and they're representing the fixed signs. There's a lion, there's a bull, there's a human, which is Aquarius, and then there's an eagle, which is the sign of Scorpio. So Scorpio can be, the snake, the scorpion, the eagle slash phoenix. Why is that? It's critical to understand. Um, Remember, the flag of Mexico has this complex relationship between eagles and snakes. Eagles eat snakes. So it represents the descent and the ascension. So Scorpios go deep. They have to come down, and then they go through their transformative process to then rise and ascend. So all these animals capture the different phases of the Scorpio process. The phoenix is a resurrected bird. So it's not only an eagle, it goes through death, it crashes, and then resurrects through the flames. And that, again, captures this kind of cycle of death and rebirth and descent, ascension. So don't stop believing, never started. That is something that also captures Scorpio energy, in that Scorpios will not trust without going through serious screening and discernment. So there's something about being extremely suspicious and reading between the line, never trusting what is on the surface, what is superficial, always looking at the hidden side of things or the underworld. And where does that fit in? Why? What's the intention? That's what we're going to look into. So, to understand any archetype, we have to understand the classic wheel and the order of the signs. Scorpio is the eighth sign, representing also the eighth house, following Libra. We talked about Libra and how in the previous episode, Libra represents the embrace of opposites because all the signs in the lower hemisphere are about building the self, establishing foundations. Then we reach the upper hemisphere for the first time through Libra because we are complete with ourselves. We've, found a job, found a partner, have what we need, at least as far as the list and the check box are concerned. But then comes Libra, and we suddenly realize that we're missing something, that we cannot do everything on our own, that there's an element of lack, a feeling of lack that prompts us to connect with others, but most importantly, to step outside ourselves. So Libras are bored with themselves. They're interested in the other because there's so much out there that they feel could provide a more complete experience of life. So it's not only about resources, it's about, you know, a different religion, a different point of view, a different climate. If I lived in the Arctic all my life and I'm a Libra, I would want to live in the desert just to experience what it's like to do something else opposite. Then comes Scorpio, a water sign, a fixed sign. And fixed signs are all about integration and about powering our lives. We're going to get there. But as a water sign, every water sign represents a need to get in touch with our vulnerabilities. And it's tricky for Scorpios because Cancer is a sign that represents vulnerability, but in the safety of their home. So a child, can be vulnerable because they're sheltered by their parents and their house. And that's what a house is about. It allows you to just not, put your guards down and share your insecurities and concerns so you can be vulnerable safely. Pisces is about being vulnerable as a universal being. The fact that, you know, we can control life. We are at the mercy of larger forces. So it's another kind of parent-child dynamic, except that this time the parent is the universe or it's God. And we are vulnerable beings, trying to survive existence. So it's a larger spiritual scale of the Cancerian theme. And so Pisces can also recognize the vulnerability of others. That's where compassion comes from, the ability to identify with someone who's different from you, because even though they're different skin color, different culture, we all share those same needs and vulnerabilities. We all need love, we all need health. And so that ability to relate is part of that vulnerability. that water signs and Pisces can feel. Um, Scorpio is constantly addressing vulnerabilities, but it's because they're terribly afraid of them. They are constantly aware of dangers, and they know that the only way to be strong, to survive, is to heal the vulnerabilities. And you cannot heal them if you don't face them. So that's part of the reason why Scorpio represent our confrontation with death, because death is the ultimate vulnerability. You know, it's when you exhaust your power, you run out of fuel, you know, you lose the battle, whether it's a disease or whether it's a duel. It's an ultimate surrendering. And yet Scorpios face their mortality, understanding that they're not invincible. And yet, even though Scorpio face their own death or experience losses, somebody else may die on them, they constantly work on themselves to cheat death, to push death away. This is why it's a sign of resurrection, more so than death. So in order for you to resurrect, you need to be aware that you can die. And that's where it comes from. But Scorpio is not a sign of surrendering. It's not a sign of giving up. It's not a sign of really relinquishing, you know, existence. That's where Mars comes in as a ruler. You know, Mars begins the journey with Aries. That's the ignition of our existence, of our consciousness. That's when the engine begins and our life, our individual destiny is underway. But then comes the second Mars sign, the Scorpio, where we run out of fuel, where you know the engine is starting to falter, is starting to show signs of vulnerability. And Mars is programmed to keep fighting, to never, ever give up. So in Scorpio, the difference between Aries and Scorpio is that Aries begins the journey from the womb to birth, but Scorpio is facing the possible end of their journey, the end of a relationship, the end of their career, the end of their lives if they've, you know, are going through a health crisis. But the Mars programming, wiring is you have to do everything to get a second lease, to survive this. So obviously a lot of strength, psychological strength, as well as moral, physical strength. So Scorpios, what I'm trying to say is embracing endings, but it's actually constantly trying to overcome vulnerabilities, and that also means overcome death, win over death. The real sign of dying is Pisces. It's the end, you know, that's the end of the journey. So the 12th house and Pisces do represent the actual surrender. And what do you see here between Scorpio, 8th house, and Pisces, 12th house? We enter the transpersonal realm. So from Aries to Libra, even though Libra is the first upper hemisphere chart, it's still a personal sign. It's still a personal planet, Venus. Once we get into Scorpio, Mars transforms into Pluto, and the personal transforms into transpersonal. That is what the transformation is about, is that you become a spiritual being through Scorpio, and you don't have a choice. Because if you don't go through this transformation, if you don't recognize your spiritual nature, you really end your journey there. So the only way for you to survive is to go through that upgrade of consciousness. And that's when Mars turns into Pluto. Read read an article on my website on the octaves, or you can watch a video on YouTube on the octave, the 3 parts: Mars, Pluto, Venus, Neptune, Uranus, Mercury. I know I go into much greater depth about this kind of transmutation and the meaning of the octaves. But there's no doubt that Pluto rules Scorpio. Many traditional astrologers say, well, yeah, the transpersonal planets, they're there, they're important, but they don't rule signs. That's not reality. They rule the sign, and Pluto is the ruler of Scorpio. The transformation from Mars to Pluto is what Scorpio's about. So once we go through this transformation, I'm going to unpack how this happens. Then we move into the transpersonal realm. We move into the spiritual awakening. And then Jupiter comes in and we look for meaning. Why are we here? What's the truth? How far can we go? And what is this all about? These deep, larger existential questions. And Saturn brings us to understanding how we are material beings aligned with a spiritual higher morality, higher guidance. This is why Saturn, is our spine, and it connects the root with the crown. So Saturn is both, the mentor, but it's also us becoming role models and how we can lead life, lead others. And we enter then the last quadrant, the 10, 11, 12 signs and houses, where the personal is now collective. No more fire signs. So it's interesting how Scorpio and Jupiter are this kind of transition into the spiritual, from the material to the spiritual, but they're not collective yet. Funny enough. We're going to get to the Sagittarius chapter next. But then as we move into the 10th sign and house, we are individuals operating in society, in community, in the oneness, Pisces, of it all. So the self is integrated into a larger mechanism, which is not only spiritual, the oneness, the unifying principle of life, but also the ability to operate in society, to stop at a red light, to pay your taxes, to contribute to the whole, and to cooperate. So these are, the transpersonal collective signs. Now, what is transpersonal? What does that really mean? The personal planet from Aries to Libra and personal signs are all about the descent, materialization, how the soul gets into the body, and it needs to now function in the physical world where there's gravity and there's finitude, and we have to, hunt for food, all those survival skills. So the personal planets represent our ability to feel whole, integrated, and functional in the material world. And it works until it doesn't. What happens all the way from Aries to Virgo, from Aries to Libra? Like we said, you have a family, you have your land, you grow your food, you have a job, you take care of your health, you have a routine, everything is established, and it seems to be the end of the road. Like you're happy, everything is working. Then Libra comes in and says, but I am needing something I don't have. I've done all this, but what about um, an opposite point of view? What about, um, you know, if I'm living in the country, what about going to the city? Um, if I am a sailor, what about climbing mountains? So through Libra, we see all the things we're missing, but it's still part of a personal journey. And that's how we connect with others who teach us about others. So then we move into Scorpio, and things start to really go south. That's when we're not only curious about others and feeling the lack and wanting to marry into another family, but through Scorpio we actually face our vulnerabilities, and that means that we face all the things that don't work any longer. So it's a time of deep psychological, physical, spiritual crisis. Suddenly, you know, you realize your spouse is having an affair. You had everything under control. You had the perfect job and the perfect white picket fence. And, your kid seemed happy. And then your spouse is, interested in somebody else. And then that threatens your security, your self-esteem, and all those things. Or your company goes bankrupt and you're out of job. You thought this would be forever. You thought, you'd have financial security, and something happens. The market changes, and then you realize that you're not as safe. You face your vulnerability. You're not invincible, nothing is forever, etc. And all these points of crisis, like I said, can be very practical. You could become sick and then you can go to work and that affects your income. So a lot of things could happen through that eighth house that plunge you into crisis. And what happens is that you try to win time. Maybe she's going to come back if she cheats on me. Maybe it's all going to come back to the same, the way it used to be. Maybe that company that goes bankrupt is going to recover and somebody's going to buy them, and we're all going to be fine. And maybe, there's a 10% chance, but 90% chance is that it's over. And when it's over, you can die, you can sink into poverty, you can crash and burn, or that's when you go down into the most vulnerable place and you can feel the rejection and you can feel like I thought life was good, right? Um, but in the depth of grief, rejection, loss, you start to think about what you can do. So once it sinks in that you're not as strong, that you're not as safe, you need to step outside your comfort zone. You need to start changing. And you start to move from the personal to the transpersonal. When you realize that your company went bankrupt because there's too much greed involved, because there is systemic corruption, because markets are not run fairly, and your spouse is cheating on you or leaving you, and you can blame them, you can be the victim, and you are. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, why did he or she lose interest in me? So the personal, my subjective view, to the transpersonal, look at the bigger picture. Maybe I wasn't home that much. Maybe I didn't listen to them. Maybe I was arrogant. Maybe I was boring. So something makes you realize that the struggle and the crisis is not just a little inconvenience, or it's not just a random accident. It's tied to a larger truth, something that goes beyond your ego. And you transform from the personal perspective to a more global, wider perspective. And that's where Pluto takes you on that journey. This is why Pluto is the first transpersonal planet. Even though in the order of the solar system, it's after Neptune, right? You have Uranus, then Neptune, and then Pluto. And many astrologers say, well, Pluto should rule Aries, not Scorpio. Not so. It rules the second Aries sign, the second Mars sign, and that is Scorpio. And it's exactly well placed there because that is the beginning of that transformation from personal to transpersonal. And if you stay in the Mars mode in that crisis, you're going to try, you know, to use more force, to use more willpower. If I push harder, maybe I'm going to stay in the company. If I force my spouse to stay with me and I threaten them with not paying child support, then maybe they're not going to leave me. So that's when you're not doing the transmutation. You're trying to regain control and to overcome your vulnerability by being a bully, by being the dark Scorpio who doesn't admit mistakes and is then becoming vindictive, is then becoming um, uh, mean and and dangerous. So that's when the Scorpio fails to go from personal to transpersonal, and they refuse the transformation. It's all free will. If you don't do the work, then it's not going to happen. And so then you become, the Scorpio that does not change, but becomes bitter, paranoid, and controlling. And that's because you're afraid of losing your power. You're afraid of being vulnerable, even though you are vulnerable. Think about some president who is disliked by many and is being vindictive and is, creating AI video of himself shitting on protesters. So that's when there's no transpersonal consciousness. It's all about maintaining my power in, no matter how. So whatever goes through your eighth house, whatever goes through your, Scorpio transit, even if you're not born with planets there, you still have a sign there. You still have Scorpio somewhere in your chart. And this will be a time where you're suddenly facing those vulnerabilities and you have to go down. That there are interesting language here and interesting imagery. You go down where you feel very vulnerable, but then you go deep where you do introspective work. Okay. And so Scorpio has to do with the shadow work. You have to face your insecurities, your inadequacies, your fear of abandonment. You thought you were the prettiest, and then people reject you, and you face your shortcomings. It's not enough to be pretty. Are you educated? Are you smart? And it's not enough to be smart. Are you kind? And it's not enough to be kind. Are you strong? Right? So you always face your limitation, your vulnerabilities, and you can experience this going down where your trust is violated and poverty, whether it's material poverty or social poverty. Nobody wants to be with you. Nobody wants to be your friend. And you're isolated, rejected, and you have to face your demons. First of all, you feel, terribly victimized because it seems unjust, and you lick your wounds. But then you need to go through that transformation, and you go to a psychologist to help you face those insecurities. Or you go to an astrologer, or you learn astrology. For me, my resurrection as a Scorpio was study astrology. From being completely insecure, this kind of spiritual transformation led to natural confidence. So that was my therapy. So some kind of therapy. And you need to look at those shadows, in one way or another. So this is a good example of how, since Pluto in the 60s and was conjunct Uranus, and Neptune was in Scorpio, think about the symbolism of Pluto, Uranus in Virgo, deep transformative work, and Neptune in Scorpio, the end of illusions, the shadow work of deception. Whatever planet is in Scorpio is where we need to do shadow work. So if in the 60s, Neptune was in Scorpio, what happened to music? We moved from swing to rock and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and David Bowie. So all these darker, more controversial, more um, politically protesting um, movements started. And of course, the love revolution and the sexual revolution, which was basically with Neptune in Scorpio, it was some kind of bubble burst. All our illusions and all the pretty, family values were debunked. Where, this kind of illusion that life was so simple when, women were baking and men were following their traditional leading role, and all the insecurities, the vulnerabilities, the true emotions were repressed. And so this illustration, you can read it, um, reflects the repression and the superficiality that doesn't work with Scorpio. So, going back to that interrelation between Scorpio and Aries, what unites them? These are signs that share a lot of things in common because they're both, uh, flavored by Mars and Pluto. So they both are focused. They both have tremendous willpower because they have that ability to survive, overcome challenges. So that ability to face challenges, and that's the confrontation. They're confrontational signs. So when something's wrong, Aries will tell you it's wrong. They won't sugarcoat. Scorpios will tell you the truth. They won't sugarcoat. And that's the moment of truth. You need that moment of truth as a sober awakening. They are change makers because they see what needs to be moved and shaken and what needs to be challenged. So they're not just confronting challenges, they are challenging the status quo, challenging safety and security if it's not authentic, if there's corruption. And there's a lot of activism. I will share something that was really an eye opener. When I was in my 20s, I volunteered for a humanitarian organization. So we were basically collecting donations and then going to crisis situation and circumstances, whether it was an earthquake, a civil war, um, some kind of emergency situation, and we would bring the goods and bring some relief to those areas. So it was packed with action and a lot of, really, the motto was like, let's do it. And as a young astrologer then, because I was already into astrology, I was expecting everybody to be Aquarius, to be Pisces, because these are the idealistic, the humanistic, the one who care for humanity. But that was not the case. Statistically, everyone in that organization, I'm talking about 18, 20 people, without exception, had the sun, the moon, or both in Aries and Scorpio. And eighth house, because that's exactly what it was about. It was about, let's do it. It's up to us. Pisces and Aquarius can be ideologically compassionate, but they're not action signs. They're not, getting dirty in the field. So you need that kind of operational energy of the Scorpio Aries, of the Mars Pluto, to bring relief, to make a difference, to change. So the activism, those who are going to protest, those who are going to defy order because they see something is not right, are going to be those signs. Intensity. tremendous intensity. What is intensity? It's that concentration and that not letting go, not lining up. We need to go to the root of things. So intensity brings strength. It also brings obsession, which Mars people suffer from if it's not managed properly. People with strong angular Mars or Mars on the nodes can be obsessive. When they want something, they go for it and they don't give up and they don't forget, and it ends up too much sometimes. These are also the signs that represent ending and beginning. So there's a lot of starting over. There's a lot of blank slates, especially Aries. But Scorpio is about that resurrection. If I'm divorcing, I'm going to resurrect in having a better marriage. If I'm losing my job, I'm going to have a better job. So it's that descent, going down into the loss, into the grief, into the pain. But then going into, Pluto coming in and telling me, transform your consciousness, look at the spiritual nature of your life, understand why you're here. And once you gain those insights, your Kundalini awakening, that is part of the serpent. Now we understand the snake is that Kundalini energy that rises from the root through the spine to the crown. And so we, through Scorpio and the eighth house, we shift from the material perspective to a spiritual perspective. That's our first gateway. And Pluto is the first gatekeeper. And that is why Pluto rules Scorpio. So you descend to the lowest in order to understand the deepest. So when you're in a dark place, you sometimes tend to think you've been buried, but perhaps you've been planted. And that is interesting because Scorpio not only ascend like the phoenix, but they go higher than the place they came down from. That is the magic. That is the reward. And that's why it's so difficult. But Scorpios are, because of that, resilient, extremely perceptive, and won't trust easily. Remember, we talk about vulnerability and we talk about facing those insecurities, having to face your shadow, having to face those weakest, broken places, because that's the only way you can go past them. You can heal. So that honesty is the remedy. And we go now back to the venom of the scorpion, the venom of the snake. Now there's a whole industry related to the medicinal qualities of venom, that in the right dosage, venom can cure cancer, can cure paralysis, can reactivate the nervous system. So it's all about how you use it. You could be destructive. And you could regenerate. So in the descent, Scorpios can be self-destructive. They hate themselves, they hate life, and it can lead to sabotage, self-sabotage. How many times, a Scorpio who face their insecurity come into a relationship, let's say Venus or Mars in Scorpio, or the moon in Scorpio, emotional, and they are in a relationship and everything's going fine and their partner loves them, but they don't trust them. They expect to be rejected because they've been wounded in the past. And so they're going to push their partner to the edge to test if they stay or if they go. And that becomes not transformational, but that becomes PTSD, self-destructive, post-traumatic stress, where I've been wounded and my wounds are starting to take control of me. My vulnerabilities, water, are starting to take over. And so I make my partner's life so miserable that they end up leaving me. And then I can say to myself, see, they didn't like me. I knew this all along. So, that's when it becomes toxic, another form of toxicity, where the venom, is self-inflicted. And then you destroy everything. You destroy your family, you destroy your marriage, you destroy your job, everything that's on the way, just because there's a lot of self-hatred and that kind of punishment. But then, comes ascension. And through Scorpio, if we go through the depth, Scorpios start to become not just paranoid, but more emotionally discerning. Trust is not free. You need to earn their trust. And they can be very forgiving if you show that you mean to do well. So there's a lot of battle between darkness and light, right, in Scorpio. Am I going to use power in a materialistic, egoic way, or am I going to recognize my spiritual powers and bring good to the world as well as myself? The other thing through this process is that they develop not just discernment, but emotional intelligence. That is what defines a higher frequency Scorpio, is that they become therapists. And a therapist is able to understand wounds, to see where they're coming, and to bring the medicine, the healing. So basically, that can also manifest in growth that is also on all level. Suddenly my relationships are improved. I meet deeper people, better people. I have a better job that better suits me. I'm able to break the pattern of abuse in my family. Let's say I have Saturn in Scorpio, and one of my parents was abusive because they were insecure. So maybe they abandoned me. Saturn, parent, Scorpio, abandonment. Whether, they didn't care about me, or they had to leave for another reason. And so I'm going through this descent, if I have Saturn in Scorpio, where I don't trust authority, where I see a lot of vulnerability. I see these people who have authority are corrupt. They abuse their power. But I have that symbol myself. So am I going to repeat the mistakes of my parents and lineage? Or am I going to be able to break the pattern through transformation and introspection? And then through Saturn in Scorpio, build a new structure, a better structure, ascending to a spiritual consciousness. And when I say spiritual, it doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to involve God per se, but it has to do with a transpersonal understanding of life, how everything is interconnected, and how, the sins and the wounds and the abuse of my parents and ancestors are related to certain realities. They're not random. That is part of the transpersonal understanding, is that nothing happened just because it happens. There are truths we need to uncover. So this leads in one way or another to an empowerment. So any planet you have in the eighth house or in Scorpio is in its own realm going to go through these phases. If it's Venus, then it's going to affect your relationships, where you're going to have to face vulnerabilities, insecurities, and where you're going to have to do the work to jumpstart your relationship. If it's the moon, then it's your sense of safety in this world. What makes you safe? What made you safe in the past, and how unsafe you may feel because of loss of poverty or change, and how you can then build a stronger, safer reality for you and others. um if you have Mars in Scorpio, it has a lot to do with your willpower. So Mars wants to win. Mars says never give up, and you have to win the day. But then Mars in Scorpio is suddenly facing circumstances where they come at the end of their rope, where they run out of motivation, and where they lose battles. And in this place where they feel defeated, they go through the transpersonal and they resurrect and they come back as victorious, as winners, who will now use their power more consciously. This can happen sexually with Mars. People with Mars in Scorpio, at first can feel very sexual because there's a strong engagement and there's strong intensity and merging energy. But at some point, their sexuality starts to suffer. It could be that they don't feel attractive anymore. It could be that sex becomes meaningless, that it's not really working for them, that it's empty. And they can go through periods of purging and celibacy. But then at some point, they reignite, they transform their sexuality to make it more conscious, to make it more benevolent, to actually go through a spiritual experience in their sexuality and free themselves from all kinds of shame, judgment, whatever it is that they need to liberate themselves from. But what I'm saying is that their sexuality is now deeper, more wholesome. And so you go through all the signs, all the planets. So this descent, ascension, is very much the Mars principle. Mars needs, to be born. And look at the triangle of birth, right? It's the vagina. It is through that we come into life and then into form, where we are actually incarnated into a body, physical, Earth, Taurus. So then we learn to operate through the lower dimensions of life: survival, find food, protect your territory, have kids to help you and to continue your legacy. Build your home, you know, chop wood and carry water and build a shelter and all of those skills, the descent, until you reach a point where what worked, what was great, starts to fade, doesn't work as well anymore. The formula is not eternal. And then you need to make those shifts. But before you make those shifts, you need to realize that there's a problem. Sometimes it's just emptiness that makes you realize I have everything. I have wealth, and my spouse is pretty, and I'm not happy. So that's another form of existential crisis. Then you transform. Your Mars needs the Pluto jolt in order to rise like a volcano from the root to ascension. And Phoenix, Kundalini, all of that. I also recommend you watch this video on the modes, which includes the fixed signs. So the fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius, are kind of the middle signs, right? They're between the start of the cardinal and the end of the mutable. They represent basically the force, the individuality, the willpower, all of them. That's what makes them so sturdy and so powerful. They represent power because they represent how we power our lives. It's not enough to have dreams. How are you going to power your dreams? Do you have enough electricity? Do you have enough juice? Right? So explore that video. So I'm going to show you some charts. Prince Charles, King Charles III, born with a Scorpio sun, conjunct Chiron, and square Pluto. So he's kind of a double signature, we call it. The sun, ruler of Leo, is in the sign of Scorpio, and it squares the ruler of Scorpio in Leo. It's a mutual reception. And so that basically means that King Charles will go through this necessary metamorphosis where he's going to face his own limitations, his own weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the solar realms, which also rules his ascendant. So the ascendant is what we're planting. It's what we are developing, and it's our agenda. So the agenda is to be king, right? Leo, it's to be a leader. But it's in it's in Scorpio. So there's on the one hand the promise of you being a monarch, but on the other hand, you have to do some shadow work. Something's not going to go as well as you expect it, or at least as easy. And so as a child, he was not the favorite son, even though he was the elder who was the first in line for the throne. His mother preferred Andrew, who was the hero and the kind of the favorite. So he was always kind of the serious, not so popular. He married Diana, who was this extremely charismatic, gentle, and popular person, and he looked like the ugly frog next to her, which is so Scorpio, right? The Nobody likes me. I'm not as popular as her. And then he was jealous of her, jealous of her popularity, tried to hold her back, and a lot of passive aggressive behavior. And part of it was that he rejected her. She felt unloved by him. And she went through her own spiral of rejection where she was loved by the people, but not loved by her man. And then, of course, he had an affair, which was part of all this. But he was constantly, juggling this um, being rejected versus being the one who rejects. And Scorpios can get caught into this. Who's going to reject first? Then you have the power. Because if I'm rejecting you, it means I'm in control. If you reject me, I'm vulnerable. But it gets more interesting when we also look at the relationship with his father, not just with the queen and not just with his wife. But when you look at a sun Chiron, you may see, this is not an easy relationship with the father. So wherever you have Scorpio, like we said, there's going to be some need for shadow work. The relationship with the father may start difficult. So it may start as, I don't like my father, or my father doesn't like me. So there's a distancing, a rejection, a feeling that you don't relate to the father, that you're not, feeling that the father gets you. There could also be a loss where the father is not there, a divorce, or losing a father. And so that emptiness of death plays into that. But in this case, it's a relational loss. Charles was not close to his dad and felt, that mutually they didn't meet each other's expectations. But then the son is also the resurrection, right? And so he eventually, his mother passes and he becomes the king. And even as a king at old age, he's facing cancer. He has to survive treatment. So there's a lot of, again, the moment that he is in his prime and glory from a status point of view, son, he faces those setbacks. But what's the biggest setback that he faced as a monarch? The son is also his son, children. So there's one son that is taking him through a Scorpio ride. There is the easy, good son, William, who is going to be the successor, Leo, son. He's going to continue the line, Leo, son. And then there's the challenging son who marries, someone from another culture, who is kind of a defiant, liberated woman who is doing shadow work. And Meghan comes for a year or two in England, marries Harry, and she does all the Scorpio stuff because her chart is very Plutonian. She has a very powerful Pluto in the fourth house, and she uncovers all the shadows, the racism, and the emotional stiffness, and the abuses. And then, Harry was imbued in that, she kind of shakes him and wakes him up to the fact that this kind of beautiful monarchy scheme is hiding a lot of skeletons, a lot of pain, a lot of abuse. And Harry has the sun in the eighth house a Scorpio house. So it's interesting. 22 Scorpio, 22 Virgo in the eighth. You think a sextile is easy? Well, ask Harry and Charles how well they get along. So what you see here is Prince Harry has both his sun in the 12th, excuse me, in the 8th, which represent his relationship with his father, and Saturn in Scorpio, which represents parents in general. So he lost his mother, the loss of Saturn in Scorpio, being orphaned. But as a result of the loss, there were so many shadows. She died in a tunnel under mysterious circumstances. Nobody knows exactly, or maybe somebody knows, but most of the public speculates that there may have been conspiracies, that she was killed and it was not random. In one way or another, Harry is exposed to the fact that there are a lot of hidden truths. There's a lot of corruption. And his loss of a parent was not just a personal grief, but it was marred with controversy. And he doesn't trust. And so when Megan comes in and she kind of triggers his own shadow work and looking deep into the limitations and into the corruption of the monarchy, it it fits, it triggers something that's there, and he becomes awkwardly, not very intelligently, the defiant, the one who is going to speak of all the problems of the monarchy, and he basically burns that bridge. Will there be a resurrection? What will happen with his own line, with his own sun, as Harry has an eighth house sun square Mars? Maybe, it's going to pass to the next generation. But you see the complexity of doing this psychological work. And in a way, as damaging, as difficult as their relationship is, it was necessary. Because with an eighth house sun, Harry had to kill his father. He had to dethrone him. He had to deconstruct him. And perhaps there will be a phoenix rising. But for now, it's in the descent. It's in the pain. It's in the grief. It's in the trenches of Scorpio. Will there be a transcendence? Will there be a transpersonal resurrection? Will Pluto bring the light? Another interesting example, Joe Biden with 3 planets in Scorpio in the 12th house. And, I've talked about him several times. But it's a fascinating chart because it's in the 12th house, and he was a public figure from very early on, the youngest senator. So I speak about how the 12th house represents public roles, how we become accidental leaders, how we can function on a global scene. But the 12th house is unforgiving when it comes to the personal. So if you are a senator, a politician with a sun in the 12th, or somebody who is doing collective work, it works well. And you can indeed be successful. But the moment he was elected, in his 30s as the youngest senator, he lost his wife and daughter in an accident and became single parent to traumatized boys. So you see how the Scorpio here put him in such a complex situation, Mars square Pluto, where everything was ending. Like he was about to be so popular and be so successful. And then there's tragedy. And this tragedy takes him on a path of deep grief, but having to resurrect himself. And so slowly but surely, he does the work and eventually, is grows very close to his kids, remarries, but has a kid who is a drug addict and a wild card, and another kid who ends up having cancer and dying on him. So, son, children, square Pluto, Mars, difficulties. But he becomes president and vice president and then president. So there's the depth, there's the descent, there's the grief and the ascension of doing also, I know some of you don't like Democrats, but he did a pretty good job stabilizing the country and restoring a lot of things after the chaos, particularly environmental policies and social policies. So that's interesting. But then comes the debate with Donald Trump and the Scorpio, who has a good record, suddenly shows vulnerability. And he's not there, and he's sick, and he's getting older, and a mix of perfect storm leads to the fact that he is suddenly rejected by the people who are the closest to him. So Uranus at that time in July is opposing his sun. Uranus is the friends, it's the party, and they feel like he's not healthy, sixth house, and pressure him to step down. The debate that was so catastrophic for him occurred when Mars was at 13 Taurus opposing his Mars. So we talked about Mars winning battles in Scorpio and then losing battles. So it was a huge defeat that led to a chain reaction of not only stepping down, but being ridiculed, being thrown under the bus. When you compare how Republican cheer, support their their leader no matter what, unconditionally. Doesn't matter if he cheats, doesn't matter if he's corrupt, they're there. And when Biden makes this, one misstep, he is devoured by everybody. And we can understand why, right? We can understand that the stakes were high and we are in a public situation. So it's not about, my dear friend Joe, it's about president, you're too old for this. But it's that kind of catastrophic downfall that Scorpio can experience, the rejection. And here triggered by Uranus, the party, internal rejection. It's not a loss of election. It's his own people throwing him under the bus. And so, as a Scorpio, there's these moments of immense power, moments of incredible transcendence, and moments of deep descent, deep facing vulnerabilities, limitations. And that's what makes Scorpios, you know, um, resilient. They went through stuff. Another drama example, this is Mohammed Bouazizi. He is the one who um, was living in Tunisia in 2010 and was a merchant selling merchandise. and the police harassed him and confiscated his booth. And he was so beaten. Saturn in Scorpio, he felt like the system, the authorities were corrupt and failing him. And he became so angry, so infuriated that he went to protest in front of the Tunisian parliament and self-immolated, set himself on fire. Talk about Aries sun with Mars in Scorpio and Saturn in Scorpio. And all this happens when Mars Pluto are conjunct in Capricorn. It has to do with authority figures. So he's confronting in such a destructive way. But this ends up igniting, the Arab Spring Revolution. How, think about that Mars in Scorpio, how from a place of defeat, and he ends up dying from his wounds, he ignites something much bigger than himself, which also brings Neptune square to Mars, the martyrdom, and how the personal becomes transpersonal. His own grief becomes a collective message, Neptune. Malcolm X, racial injustice, systemic injustice. Again, another Saturn in Scorpio who does not trust the system. And as a young boy, Malcolm X lost his father. So he experienced that lack of a role model and difficult role models because whoever was in charge wasn't really fully available for him. But then he not only, from a personal life where he feels abandoned by his father's loss, he then becomes abandoned by the system. He feels like, the United States is racist. And he engages as a Mars Pluto in this activism and battle. Radical. He doesn't want to compromise. He's against integration. He joins the Muslim Brotherhood, which is another institution that give him, on the one hand, status, wisdom. So he goes into this transformation of, adopting a spiritual system. But even there, he ends up leaving the Muslim Brotherhood because he doesn't trust their methods and motivations. So, and then he's assassinated. So this kind of scorpionic transformation is very graphic here as well. Another Saturn in Scorpio, since we're on it, is Marilyn Monroe, with Saturn in Scorpio in the fourth house, Mars, Uranus in the eighth house, and Pluto on the north node. So even though she was this lofty, beautiful blonde, something very apparently superficial, she had her own battles. She went through tremendous trials and resurrections, abandoned as a girl, abused sexually. Mars in Pisces in the eighth house, is where sexual victimization. And yet, as from a sexual victim, she becomes a sex symbol. See the resurrection here. And from this abandoned girl who has unstable parents, she becomes a superstar. She becomes also her own executive. Not only is she growing in popularity, but she's also defying the Hollywood system. And she felt like Hollywood was not treating women fairly. So she built her own production company. And so you see that Saturn rising from the corruption, deconstructing what the industry was about, the system, and building her own, with higher values, um, stronger ethics, Saturn, and succeeding. And unfortunately, she passes as again of as the whole affair with JFK um, kind of re-triggers her sense of abandonment. And maybe there's a conspiracy there that can also be revealed. Lastly, Grace Kelly, and I wanted to bring Grace Kelly because she is not the classic Scorpio, even though she's a Mars, Sun, South Node, Mercury in Scorpio, all trine Pluto. She did not start her life, with limitations and having to outgrow and feeling rejected. She grew up in a family that was successful. Her father was very wealthy. Don't remember what he was industry, what industry, but she was well to do. And so there was a lot of power and status. And yet she defied, the Catholic family and the gender stereotype by wanting to be an actress and basically going against conventions. And so she ends up being this extremely popular, very beautiful, and sought after actress. So much so, that the power is so strong. And the Pisces moon brings this magic and film as well into the mix. And she works also a lot with Alfred Hitchcock, who explores a lot of dark themes. So a lot of, the producer that she worked with were not, were kind of hardcore scorpionic as well. But then she's so popular that the Prince of Monaco notices her in the Cannes Festival, and he wants to marry her. So she's gonna not just be a Hollywood star, but she's gonna be a princess. Talk about ascension. But what ends up happening is that it's a gold cage. Um, she looks pretty. She is, at the peak of now monarchy and royalty, and she has a beautiful family, but he doesn't let her do anything. She can't work, and he keeps her very tight. And so that scorpionic control of him being afraid that she's going to go back to Hollywood and all that, he wants to keep things conventional. And as a princess, she needs to just be pretty. And that doesn't gel well with a Scorpio. They're not here to just be pretty. They want to dig, they want to investigate, they want answers. And so you can anticipate that there's a lot of deep psychological turmoil going on during this marriage, where she's contrasted by the glamour and the isolation. And eventually she dies of an accident, a car crash. And so her children are orphaned. So, Scorpio can go through these, start high and then go through their crisis later, or you may see them start with very humble means. They're not going to be the popular kids. They're not going to be the one everyone wants to date. They're gonna be the one who has a nose that's a little too long, and not always the witty one, and a lot of awkwardness, a lot of insecurities, being too short, being too fat, being too poor. But then as they kind of work on those things and explore and develop a deeper consciousness, they win the battles. They become popular in a different way. They, overcome the rags and access the riches and can resurrect themselves. But the moment they become asleep again, Pluto, you know, and the Scorpio sting comes back to inject medicine, hard medicine. So, an evolutionary perspective on Scorpio. Thank you for your time and join our circles.